I thought of a few very important angles to add or tangents as an addendum to my frankly my critique of Noam Chomsky, um, and I mean it pains me to do this. I'm not keen on griping at Noam Chomsky, but essentially he fought the good fight of his epoch, and he came from that with a certain toolkit, which is frankly, uh, it's not nuanced enough. His radical leftism, as it were, has, I would say, even lost resonance with his own principled left Marxism. His libertarian left Marxism is conspicuously convoluted because he's essentially trying to pander to a generation of disaffected youths in their late 20s, essentially, that have been corrupted by, I would say, in some sense, a combination of the postmodernistic scourge, but also kind of perhaps some of the laxness in Noam Chomsky's own positions. In that, you can kind of develop this false dichotomy because you've got a rock and a hard place. You've got you're saying what you think is true, and you theoretically modeling things, uh, and then you are pointing out the lies on the other side. But who's pointing out the lies on your side of the aisle, essentially? And I have not seen Noam Chomsky get into an actual intellectual debate in far too long. I mean the last thing that I've known him. I mean, look, he takes tough questions, but he's chairing and fielding those. Well, I mean, he has the platform to robust. He's not engaged in a fractious intellectual exchange. I mean, the last time I saw Noam Chomsky actually in an intellectual debate was essentially with William Buckley, a few times. In the sort of in the forests and things. With the orange juices, and then obviously the famous showdown between him and Foucault, and then essentially, the American completely decimated the light of continental European visionary thought, or something like that. It was a shameful day in French intellectualism, that essentially, this Yankee had come in and literally swept the floor with Foucault. Um, and quite frankly, that was vitally important. If that did not happen, the acceleration of the degeneration of the psychiatric sort of intellectual establishment, um, which, I would say the only part of the world that is kind of immune to that are places that have robust legal systems. And I know this sounds boastful and conceited. As far as I know, the only legal system that actually has any real bones in it is my legal tradition, which we essentially inherited from the Roman Dutch, and then it was encapsulated by the British common law, which replaced the Roman Dutch procedural law, because the Roman Dutch procedural law is a bit of a nightmare. But the British, uh, you know, uh, they don't mess with what works, and they would have replaced it if they thought that their legal system was superior. But quite frankly, they knew that it wasn't. They were incredibly, they couldn't replace something that they saw was so eminently better than what they had, essentially. Anyway, um, and then when we got our Supreme Constitution, uh, and essentially the right of equality, supposedly, as it is referred to, the right of equality, there is no right of equality. It's a practice, and you have to be able to read the Constitution, perhaps with some sophistication. I wouldn't say too much sophistication. If you read all the relevant clauses in the Bill of Rights, it's not that hard to piece together. But essentially, because of and I, this is not true in each and every case, but just to thematically condense it into a motif, you have affirmative action hires in the judiciary, plus legal scholars from America twisting their ears and installing essentially this kind of disgusting legal positivistic expertise, in which the government can be rationalized as having a prerogative to essentially dictate morality and dictate the form that morality and the citizen and the individual has no recourse to challenge the form of law that the state takes, so long as it is done in the name of the Constitution. And so essentially we have that disgusting component of American law of trial and error has essentially been injected into the constitutional order, which essentially means that the court is beholden to the dictate and the fiat of the ruling party, and the individual citizen, so long as the government can piece together some kind of supposedly rational kind of balancing act or something like that, that it's rational. No, not that it's justifiable, but just that it's rational. The means that the government takes is rational. It doesn't matter if it also actually infringes other people's right to be treated equally before the law. And it doesn't matter if other people's value of non-racialism is essentially squandered or displaced or diverted, which is quite frankly unjustifiable. As if it's not possible to create transformative policy that doesn't target on the basis of superficial characteristics like race and gender. As if that's the only way to do it. As if you couldn't just target directly the disadvantaged, as if you couldn't just target means testing things, or if you couldn't just target underachievers in some metric, in some objective non-racialist metric. And so, in some sense, America is wide open for this, which is why essentially, the only protection they have against was the sort of the civil rights legislation, which I think Thomas Sowell technically has the correct answer, is that technically we didn't need it. We just need to understand that in the Constitution, the provision for what is it? No fear or favor before the law. So I can't remember. But there is equal protection under the law. That essentially equal protection under the law should essentially infer non-racialism, essentially. It should affirm all the non-values, non-sexism, and that essentially you just have objective criteria. And so you have to have objective criteria that essentially is passive on those metrics. It's that simple. It's not complicated. But when you get the lawyers speak and you get the psychologists involved, then suddenly everything under the sun becomes permissible. Because you've got some crazy sounding quack talking about societal systemic oppression. It's sociologically infused psychiatry and psychology. It's culturally bound. It's essentially that kind of epistemological pluralism is essentially the moral side of the coin for what is essentially legal positivism, which is essentially put both of those things together, and you get Nazi philosophy, which is that everyone should just have their own ethno-state, because we're not going to be able to get along anyway, because if we see one another, we'll make each other feel envious or greedy or something like that, and we'll displace each other's sense of comportment, or in some sense, because essentially we're troubled by each other's symbolic representations of ourselves in our historical narratives, which are allowed to essentially be as wild and fanciful and crazy as we also wish to imagine. And so, I'm the Queen of Spain, I'm the King of England, that's how I identify. I mean, it's that kind of lunacy, essentially. And there's no rationale stopping it, because when you're before a judge, then essentially the judge is part of the government and they can't restrict freedom of speech. So a lawyer can say whatever the hell they want, essentially, and they can get a license to get away with it. And it's trial and error. If you get away with it until an error is found with it, or something like that, because the substance of the law is gelatinous. Anyway. So what to say about Noam Chomsky? So in some sense, I hate to say this, but he's a dead player now, essentially. He tries to inspire something, and he tries to, according to his own toolkit from his own time, uh, 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 I mean, he is providing some important context and perspective, I think. And he says, you've got it much easier than we ever had, and he's completely true when he says that. And people are asking him essentially for inspiration and for a plan, and he is humble enough to essentially know that he doesn't have one. And his toolkit is what he has defined an intellectual to be. But essentially, as an intellectual, I would say he has. I mean, obviously, he's in his dotage. He's old. You can't, you know, um, you can't extract blood from a stone. He should be. The mantle should move on to some new field of intellectuals. But sadly, the so-called liberals of today are they're superficial. They are. They're consumerist. There was this beautiful line at the beginning of the episode of His Dark Materials, second season, episode 5. At the beginning of the episode, um, is a wonderful blurb about the consumerism of the world, or the consumerism of societies today, and how they are essentially faithless societies, that they have double the malls and half the churches, and their government is twice as corrupt as the magisterium, because this is a science fictional world. But a beautiful blurb. I wish I could actually extract that and place that in. But yeah, I mean, if someone wants to go look at that, you just find episode 5, season 2 of His Dark Materials, and it's quite close to the beginning of the episode. You have to watch the intro, and you have to watch some scenes, I think. Um, and just as you knew, because it gives you what happened previously or something, and then as the episode starts, it starts with that blurb, and you have to understand that this guy in the car, he's not necessarily the good guy or the bad guy, and that's how I see Noam Chomsky today, because he just sees this revolutionary potential in the masses, and I would say that it's a dangerous potential, um, because they're much more likely to fulfill the prophecies, those dark prophecies of the Italian Marxist fascists, rather than uh, uh, the Rosa Luxemburg liberal left Marxists. I mean, I consider myself still a liberal left Marxist, but I mean, my form is completely. I want capitalism to continue. I don't want to adopt a state. I don't want to subject people to some kind of re-education and indoctrination programs. I want to have a settled state with a default economic system, and then I will try to create an organization that just tries to create an alternative economic model but stays under the same rubric of everyone else in society, that follows the same general laws, as it were. And that there's a way to opt out of the system if you're being responsible enough, and then eventually you can have your own independent, let's say, really free agent, and you can invent things, and you can help your neighbors then to follow your model if they so wish to. You can proselytize your model, a faith-based, essentially, way of somewhat of a reimagined anarcho-syndicalism, because I also think that there's a large psychological component which is completely missing. The revolution is not going to be possible with this level of psychological depravity. We're going to have to work out what's going on with psychology and consciousness on some level before anything is going to be possible. And people are too enamored with this idea that essentially, um, I have 5 values that I live by, and 3 of them are real values, and 2 of them are questionable values, and this is a bit of a this is not uh, this is just a kind of a rough sketch of a practice, but essentially, I value seriousness, I value carefulness, and I value honesty. And I am questionable of kindness, and I'm questionable of positivity. And how you would actually put that into values is that look out for those who are being uncareful, look out for those who are being unserious, and look out for those who are being dishonest. It's the unvalues, the non-racialisms. Those are the real values, that you know what you devalue. You can't know what you value because you don't know your own values. You can only know what you don't like, what you dislike. And then when you wear that on your sleeve, then you can at least start to detach from the bullshit that's in your fucking head, because you're an American consumerist society and you have tacitly inclined yourself to essentially following some intellectual fad that you can't even seriously digest yourself. Because, excuse me for being blunt, but I mean, perhaps if I was better looking, people would incline to listen to me a bit more easily, or something like that. That's the kind of consumerism that we have to sort of deal with. That's the kind of bar to intellectualism that we have at the moment. Um, it's ironic how the values have essentially switched. That essentially, what used to be a substantive form of engagement, which was traditionally on the left side of the aisle, as it were, um, as far as I can see, sort of is between Jordan Peterson and Milo Yiannopoulos. And I mean, it is sad that you can't deal with people like ContraPoints. They are this fascistic poetry that they come up with. It is premised on this vile conflation of causation is correlation, essentially. That, as soon as you're not going to allow yourself to prove, to justify your rationalism, as soon as you allow yourself to dispense with that kind of rhetorical engagement with things, then essentially correlation is indistinguishable from causation. And this is essentially because in the American system there is no such thing as legal causation. There are not proper permanent theories of legal causation, because you need legal causation in principle, and then you need legal tests that correspond to that. But because the principles are essentially vacant, or are not there in the American system, law in America is not the rule of law. Law in America is trial and error. It's the rule of man. The law of trial and error is might makes right at the end of the day. And this is why you have secret agents. This is why you have secret plans, secret politico things. I mean, and look at these people in what was, I think, I don't know, but to me it seems somewhat unlikely that Trump lost the election in the numbers that occurred, and the kind of fishiness around the incidents, around the strange countings and things like that. It's the level of inane desensitivity to that on the left is quite frankly proof that they are just the same kind of useful idiots that would have got Hitler into power. Who I think, okay, this might seem like look, I can only wildly speculate, but to me it seems quite likely that Kamala Harris is going to be the president within the first term if Joe Biden reaches that seat. And I don't know really what her politics is. I think that she might go rogue if she had such an opportunity. Look, I can only wildly speculate, but essentially, they both had essentially a totally negative campaign with hollow slogans, social justice, semantics, and rhetoric. When you create a moral panic and you create these emergencies, these systemic oppressive emergencies of systemic proportions, and then people will swallow anything. I guess, look, in some sense, maybe the people who have schemed this whole thing up, maybe the establishment has the best economic interests of the American people at heart. Maybe it's not nefarious. Maybe it's actually for their own good. But my point is that it's been infantilism since the beginning. So I just want to challenge that. I just want the infantilism to end so that you can stop essentially spewing your cultural poison around the world. Because I mean, look, there might not be a Hitlerian figure in American politics, but there certainly is going to be one in my country if you don't cut out the bullshit. South Africa is imbibing this poisonous atmosphere that you are noxiously broadcasting over the world because of your disgusting culture war, because you're an infantilized people with not a real legal system. It's quite that simple. Stop exporting your. I can only use epithets and insults, but essentially it's. I mean, look how dysfunctional your culture is. You have neighbors who are essentially at war with other groups of citizens who essentially they have to pen themselves together into political tribes because there's no dialogue, and I blame the left for that. The reason why there's no dialogue is because you keep on imbibing this old school Noam Chomsky style false dichotomy, which was good enough in his time, but it's not good enough for today. And you won't drop it because you have no real intellectualism, because you want to appear kind and pseudo-intellectual at the same time, or something like that. And so you'll just virtue signal, and you rely on a false dichotomy, and you rely on the narrative of the boogeyman. And so you willfully blind yourself to the wild dispersions that you project, just because you trust your media, and somehow the media of the other guy is beyond the pale. And it is very interesting. I mean, I would say that to a large extent it's because of this fake expertise, which somehow it gets a free pass in the legal structures. It gets, because essentially if you don't have a clever lawyer to say no, actually your expertise is somewhat irrational. You've this is concatenation. Your diagnosis is no different than a magical spell that you wish to cast upon this court. Your expertise is not legally recognized in this court. We have to establish certain legal facts of certain legal issues and certain legal facts. But because there are no high courts in America, because there are no true courts of record, which doesn't mean a court that keeps records. A court of record is not a court that keeps records. It's not what a court of record is. You can't have a court of record in America. There's only essentially a court of review and magistrates and differing degrees of seniority in magisterium or whatever, or in passing it up the chain of rationalizing the government fiat of whatever framework the government is trying to do, because essentially the legislature and you could say the framers of the Constitution, who couldn't even think of rights to put into the body of the text, who couldn't put the rights into the body of the text because they knew that they were essentially slogans, they were political rhetoric. And so you've got a playground of the rich, essentially, in America. Or, I mean, and that is not to say that it's the rich's fault. It's certainly not the rich's fault. It's the revolutionaries' fault. So if you want to blame anyone, don't blame the current rich people who are probably trying very hard to keep, as well as they can, everything afloat and pandering to this disgusting social justice warrior tripe. I mean, they are just as enculturated as everyone else. Although I would say that there is some independent thinking on the conservative arm of this sort of thing, that the conservatives actually, they see that the narrative being used to disguise this creep of concentration and centralization of all power is its accusations and its insults that it throws against its enemies they don't match the record. Look at Trump's record. I mean, they call him racist, and who has done more for people of color in America? Or minorities. I don't know what the nomenclature now is. It's a moving target so that they can tar and feather people, because it's fucking irrelevant. You know, I mean, should we even be talking about this? Should we not rather be talking about what is the record on assimilating and uplifting people that are disadvantaged economically? Why don't we have it in objective criteria so that we don't have to... Who injected race into the fucking issue? It is this radical contingent of fascistic leftist, there's no, and Noam Chomsky thinks that they can be reconciled somehow, that they can be brought into some kind of fold, and that they can maybe continue and be... And what would they do to Noam Chomsky if he was actually in their midst, if he was actually talking to them on their terms, on their turf, as it were? I shudder to think how they would say, "You're a white, rational person. Don't bring your European colonial thinking to us." They're not his friends, and he's trying to be friendly to them. And I'm just pointing that out as one thing that must be pointed out as a glaring contradiction in Noam Chomsky's own tented... I mean, look, he hopes for the best. He's somewhat the grandfather of a cultural lineage, and he has certainly made important contributions. And I don't want to disrespect the important things that he has done. And he has done very many important things. But now he needs to step aside. He is... he comes from MIT. So if the MIT people just tell him global warming is real, then he looks at the studies and he reads them. And then does he correlate that with the polymaths? Does he correlate that to the people who made the computer models, who have been vocal about how this is essentially... This is contrived. This is politically contrived, essentially. I mean, and this is the truth, is that we can't say either way. We don't know. We'll know 10 years after it happens, maybe. We'll get a glimmer of maybe how it works. But if we actually look at the record, and the best record that we have of the climate in this country, the climate in the world, on the planet, we are coming out of a little ice age. Everyone forgets that. We've had very stable climate, but not even that stable climate over the last 5,000 years. I mean, just within living within the living memory of our civilizations. Can we remember that Egypt was the bread basket of the Roman Empire? The whole Roman Empire was fed on Egypt. It was so fertile. Then the climate changed, and there was starvation in Rome because Egypt stopped. Look at Egypt today. It doesn't... You don't have... Egypt used to be an agricultural center. It literally used to feed all of Rome. I mean, that has changed over the last... I don't know all the dates. I'm actually quite uneducated, but I know general things. But essentially, so within the last 3,000 years, we've had huge climatic shifts within culture. And that had nothing to do with the Industrial Revolution. There was no Industrial Revolution. Okay, so within 3,000 years, things change. And I would say the reason why they change is because we're coming out of the little ice age. And quite frankly, it's probably a good thing that we have more carbon dioxide. Now, pollution is a real problem. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm really big on pollution. I think we need to do something about pollution. And I think that going on about climate change from CO2 is a way for government to control everything in society, because everything creates CO2. So if you put a tax on CO2 and you monitor CO2, you control and monitor everything, essentially. And then also it puts the pressure off of pollution, which is actually the real ecological disaster waiting to happen, the condition of the seas. And we're fucking talking about CO2, which is part of the fucking carbon cycle. I mean, you have to be a cretinous kind of pseudo-intellectual to not think twice about these things. I mean, do you know how much CO2 contributes to temperature? Do you have any idea how insignificant it is to fucking water vapor? And you do know that if you have more CO2 in the air, then plants grow faster. So it gets taken up more quickly. Now, I know that in the Gaia hypothesis, James Lovelock, kind of describes an accelerated negative feedback. Now, that only happens if we also have concurrently an ecological collapse, and essentially that temperatures, that there are no homeostatic. So yes, there are homeostatic features within the system. I mean, the sea is a great one. The acidity of the sea, and there are lots of things that we could do. I mean, we could quite easily artificially create algal blooms to take up CO2. Obviously, that could have a toxic knock-on effect if it's the wrong kind of algae. If it's because then essentially it can also suffocate the water, because if you have a thick layer of algae at the top of the surface of the water, you stop the sunlight and the photosynthesis of other sort of things, and things need light, and so you can end up suffocating the water as well. But there are probably things that can be done to manage certain things. You could do this on land. You could do it completely artificially. You could have ponds on land, and you could have artificial algal blooms in that way. And then you would have perhaps some biomass to essentially turn into charcoal, whatever. But regenerative agriculture is a real thing. But the vegetarians won't let us have that, essentially. But regenerative agriculture essentially makes the land more fertile. And this was stuff that was even around in the 90s that was devised with a conservationist who actually was also a good friend of mine, but because he was willing to admit that we don't know how desertification occurred, that we don't know how the Dust Bowl in America happened. And then we were able to actually work out, it was because of the destruction of the massive herds. Because when you have massive herds that are all trampling the ground simultaneously, they're breaking up the soil. So if there's a hard crust of soil, they're actually breaking it up. They're defecating and urinating. They are making the land fertile. But if you don't get the critical mass of the size of the herd, then essentially, in the hard sun after a rain, the surface, if the soil has clay in it, then the surface of the soil essentially becomes it becomes impenetrable by the water, and then you get I don't know what it's called, but essentially you get like flooding, you get like flash flooding, and people didn't realize, and they actually were killing elephants because they thought the elephants were causing the desertification in Africa, because they were like they're destroying the trees, and trees are part of nature, but actually the elephants were keeping the desertification from happening because they were clearing the trees, they were killing trees to keep the grasslands, to keep the herds being able to roam, that the great herds could roam over the grasslands, keeping it fertile. And so we have these kinds of things which have been completely inverted, that, oh no, we should just be an agricultural society. I mean, let's just regress. Let's just regress 1,500 years and be safe, because we don't understand what the fuck we're doing, but we've been told that we should be panicking and we should be following some authoritarian figure. This is how the world works now, with this kind of pseudo-intellectualism. Anyway, so I'm just giving a plethora of a view, essentially, of just how corrupted the cultural degeneration has gotten, but also how it is a natural consequence of what I would call the prime corruption in the American system, which is essentially the expertise of psychology and psychiatry, which needs to have a legal asterisk attached to it. It needs to be rejected in law as having some kind of special authority over the personages of the individual, which is obviously going to have an inclination towards justifying sociological harmoniousness, as it were, or something like that. And then you have essentially the other side of the coin of that, which is the social justice epistemological pluralism, which is, let's say, reacting to that in the most vile and juvenile sort of way. And now essentially we have, to a large extent, such a huge asymmetry I mean, I can talk about gender relations and things like that, but there's just so much corruption in terms of the culture between the sexes. And in some sense, the old sexual roles were not good enough because some men are more passive and some women are more assertive. And in some sense, that dynamic was not properly understood within the sexual norms and mores. Although I would say, even in the 70s and 80s, there was a much, or even from the 60s onwards, that there was a much more organic way that people could embody and signal their sexual role or their. I don't, but essentially, I think that there was a visceral um, authenticity which was somewhat found. And I don't want to talk too much about sexuality, but essentially now, ironically, the social justice warriors, because their boogeyman is essentially white male patriarchy or something like that. Um, Sam Vaknin talks a lot about this quite well. Um, but I mean, I disagree with him in somewhat. I mean, because he states it as a fact, he states it as a sociological theme, as it were, and I think that the underlying dynamics, which is not what he's getting into when he mentions it, or he does some, he gets into some of it, but essentially, anyway, this is a rabbit hole, but essentially the idea that we only have men now, we only have men in society. There's nothing else other than men. Everyone is just trying to be a man. That we have men with female genitalia and we have men with masculine genitalia, so we have two sexes, but we have one gender essentially. Is Sam Bucknan's? I don't want to misrepresent him because he would also perhaps add qualifications. I might not be getting it the reproduction of it exactly. I just wanted to say that uh, he had me think about it from that kind of angle. I see a much more dynamic internal structure and psychological, ideological circus going on there, which is, I think, rooted in borderline personality disorder. I think that the social justice movement is essentially a collective borderline personality disorder monster. And this is what Hitler would have called a useful idiot, because essentially it's meant to inculcate, and this is why I think that America is not going to have any kind of overt, any kind of fascism, because essentially uh, the minority population, I don't think, are all conscripted up for it, but they are going to perhaps cause some form of terrorism, perhaps. But essentially, Kamala Harris, I think, I mean, like, what is the solution to it? I mean, it's going to be crazy. It's the only stable way to have it is essentially some kind of internal segregation, is to reintroduce segregation. Um, because if you have any kind of affirmative action on a large scale, it is literally going to agitate towards overt racism as a natural response to it, because it will be unnatural. It will be, um, you're going to create problems on the ground for people. You're going to create um, disjunctions. And in some sense, the only way to fix that will be essentially to double down with some form of segregation. You're going to have a kind of a big brother police state, an ideological police state, saying, you are not allowed to have your thoughts. You have the wrong thoughts. Go see the psychologist to get corrected. Um, Go take these drugs to overcome your systemic oppression or something, like, sorry, to overcome your subliminal superiority complex, or I mean, I'm trying to, you see, superiority complex and inferiority complex are words that have been juggled so many times in psychology as well. But what I'm saying is that essentially they will say, well, if you're not happy that the other guy was promoted because of affirmative action, you need to go to the loony bin. You are insane. You're part of the problem. And then the psychologist points at you, or the psychiatrist points at you and says, it's time for the electroshock. You see that is the kind of big brother state that is looming, essentially. Um, Anyway, I just wanted to point that out. But I will say as well that the other component of this is I've lost my thread now. Oh, well, I guess I'll leave it at that.